1.5 miles. That is the exact distance between the coast of San Francisco and the island of Alcatraz. To the naked eye, it looks close. On a clear night, the inmates could see the lights of the city. If the wind was blowing the right way, they could hear the laughter of people at the yacht club just across the water. But that distance was the longest mile in the world. Between the freedom of the city and the cells of the island lay the San Francisco Bay, a treacherous stretch of water with currents so fast they could drag a strong swimmer out to sea in minutes. And the temperature? 50 degrees, cold enough to stop your heart before you even reach the shore. They called it the Rock. It wasn't just a prison, it was the trash can of the American justice system. When a man became too dangerous for Atlanta or too violent for Leavenworth, they sent him here. This was the home of Al Capone, the home of Machine Gun Kelly. The warden, James A. Johnston, had a simple rule. You are entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Anything else is a privilege. For 29 years, the FBI claimed it was escape-proof. 36 men tried to run. Most were caught. Some were shot. The rest drowned. No one had ever made it out alive. Until the morning of June 12, 1962. It was 7:15 a.m. The morning routine was sacred. The guards walked the block for the head count. Every inmate was expected to be standing at the bars, but in cell block B, 3 men were still sleeping: Frank Morris, John Anglin, and his brother, Clarence Anglin. The guard shouted for them to wake up. Silence. Annoyed, he reached his baton through the bars and nudged the pillow of Frank Morris. The head on the pillow moved, but it didn't wake up. It rolled off the bed and hit the floor with a hollow thud. The guard froze. He wasn't looking at a human face. He was staring at a dummy made of soap, toilet paper, and real human hair. The alarm shattered the morning silence. "Break out! Break out!" By the time the guards ripped the blankets off the other beds, the truth was horrifyingly clear. The beds were empty. The ventilation grates in the walls had been removed. 3 bank robbers had done the impossible. They hadn't just escaped their cells. They had vanished from the most secure building on planet Earth. This is the story of the Great Escape. The story of how 3 men defeated the FBI with nothing but raincoats, spoons, and a plan that remains the greatest mystery in American history. Every great heist needs a leader, a man who sees patterns where others see walls. For the escape of 1962, that man was Frank Morris. Frank wasn't your average criminal. He was an orphan, tossed between foster homes his entire life. He learned early on that the only person he could rely on was himself. But what made Frank dangerous wasn't his muscles, it was his mind. Prison records listed his IQ at 133. That is in the top 2% of the human population. He was brilliant, patient, and obsessed with detail. He had already escaped from prisons in Georgia and Louisiana. The system didn't know what to do with him. So, on January 20th, 1960, they sent him to the one place that was supposed to break him: Alcatraz. But Frank knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed muscle. He needed men who could endure pain. He needed the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence Anglin. 2 brothers from Georgia who were thick as thieves, literally. They weren't book smart like Frank. They were survivors. They grew up in the swamps, swimming in the dangerous currents of Lake Seminole. They could hold their breath, withstand freezing water, and craft tools out of nothing. They had been robbing banks together for years using a toy gun. They made it a rule never to hurt anyone. But like Frank, they had a bad habit of escaping every jail they were put in. Fate brought them all to cell block B. Frank Morris was in cell 108, John Anglin in 152, Clarence in 154, and there was a 4th man, Alan West, a car thief who occupied the cell right next to them. By late 1961, these 4 men came to a realization. They were serving massive sentences. They had no wives waiting for them. They had no future. Alcatraz was designed to be the end of the line. But Frank Morris looked at the crumbling concrete walls of the old prison, and he didn't see a cage. He saw an opportunity. The salt air from the bay was eating away at the prison walls. The concrete was getting soft. Frank gathered the team and whispered a plan so crazy it sounded like suicide. They weren't just going to walk out. They were going to dig their way out with spoons. The plan began with a spoon. Working in the prison kitchen, the men started stealing them. Not to eat, but to dig. The concrete walls of Alcatraz were old and damaged by the humidity, but they were still concrete. Every night after lights out, the men would crawl under their sinks and chip away at the ventilation grates. It was grueling work. They weren't digging a tunnel, they were widening a hole just big enough for a human body to squeeze through. To hide their work, they made fake cardboard grates painted to look like the real metal vents. When the guards walked by, everything looked normal. Behind the cardboard, the hole was growing, but spoons were too slow. They needed power. In a stroke of engineering genius, Frank Morris managed to steal a motor from an old vacuum cleaner in the prison maintenance shop. Using a melted dime as a drill bit and the vacuum motor for power, they built a functional electric drill. But a drill makes noise. In a silent cell block, it would sound like a gunshot. So how did they get away with it? Morris was smart. He timed the drilling to match the prison's music hour, the 1 hour each evening when inmates were allowed to play instruments. While the block filled with the sound of accordions and harmonicas, Morris was behind his cell wall, drilling through the concrete foundation of the prison. But breaking out of the cell was only step one. The real killer was the water. The San Francisco Bay is freezing. Without a boat, you die in 20 minutes. They couldn't steal a boat. So, they decided to build one. Over the course of months, the men stole 50 rubber raincoats. In a secret workshop they set up on top of the cell block, they cut the coats open and melted the rubber together using the hot steam pipes in the ceiling. They were vulcanizing rubber, creating a 6-by-14-foot inflatable raft. They even built plywood paddles. They had the vehicle. They had the route. Now they just needed a way to make sure the guards didn't notice they were gone until it was too late. In Alcatraz, time was measured in counts. 12 times a day, every day, the guards counted every single prisoner. The most critical counts were at night. If a guard walked past a cell and saw an empty bed, the island would go into lockdown instantly. Frank Morris knew they needed a head start, literally. For months, the men became sculptors. They stole soap from the showers. They saved toilet paper. They even used toothpaste and concrete dust from the walls they were drilling. They mixed it all together into a homemade plaster. They molded this sludge into the shape of human skulls. They painted faces on them using kits stolen from the prison art supplies. They gave them noses, ears, and closed eyes, as if they were sleeping peacefully. But a painted rock doesn't look like a man. To fool the guards, they needed the one thing you can't fake: hair. Clarence Anglin worked in the prison barbershop. Instead of sweeping the floor after cutting an inmate's hair, he would carefully scoop the hair into his pockets. Strand by strand, they glued real human hair onto the plaster skulls. They matched the hair color to their own. They even styled it. The result was terrifyingly realistic. In the dim light of the corridor, with a blanket pulled up to the chin, these heads looked exactly like Frank, John, and Clarence. By June 1962, the heads were finished. The raft was ready. The hole in the wall was wide enough. On the night of June 11th, a thick fog rolled into the bay. The guards did their final head count at 9:30 p.m. They looked into cell 108. They saw Frank Morris sleeping on his pillow. They moved on. Frank waited for the footsteps to fade. He sat up. He put the dummy head on the pillow, and he disappeared into the wall. 9:30 p.m., lights out. The guards did one last pass. They saw 3 sleeping men. Satisfied, they returned to their station. But inside the cells, the real men were already gone. Frank, John, and Clarence had squeezed through the holes under their sinks. They placed the cardboard grates back from the inside to hide their escape. They were now standing in the utility corridor, a dark, unguarded service tunnel that ran behind the cell block. It was a jungle of pipes and conduit. But there was a problem, a catastrophic problem. The fourth man, Alan West, was missing. Alan had made a fatal mistake. In the days before the escape, he had used cement to shore up his fake vent so the guards wouldn't notice it was loose. But the cement had hardened too well. He was trapped in his own cell. He kicked the wall. He clawed at the concrete until his fingers bled, but the hole was too small. From the other side of the wall, Frank Morris waited, but time was running out. Finally, Frank whispered through the vent, "We have to go." Alan West was left behind. He would be the only reason we know this story today. Now, there were only 3. They climbed 30 feet up the plumbing pipes to the ceiling of the cell block. They reached an air vent on the roof. They had already loosened the rivets months ago. With a hard shove, the vent popped open. They stepped out onto the roof of Alcatraz. The wind was howling. To their left, they could see the guard tower. The guards had rifles, but they were looking out at the boats, not at the roof. In the distance, the lights of San Francisco were twinkling, so beautiful and so close. They crept across the roof to the bakery smokestack. They slid down a drain pipe 50 feet to the ground. They crouched in the shadows, avoiding the searchlights, until they reached the water's edge. It was just past 10 p.m. They unfolded the raft made of raincoats. Using an improvised concertina, a musical instrument, transformed into a pump, they inflated it. They threw their life jackets on. They grabbed their plywood paddles. The water was 54 degrees. The tide was pulling out to the Pacific Ocean at 6 knots. Frank Morris looked back at the prison one last time. Then, they pushed off into the black water. They were never seen again. The next morning, all hell broke loose. The guards found the dummy heads. The sirens wailed. The Coast Guard deployed every cutter they had. Helicopters swarmed the sky. It was the largest manhunt in the history of the Bay Area. But the FBI had a secret weapon. They didn't need to guess how the men escaped, because Alan West told them everything. West, furious that he had been left behind, sang like a canary. He detailed the spoons, the drill, the raincoats, everything. He told the FBI exactly where the men were heading. Angel Island. The police raced to Angel Island. They combed every inch of the beach. They found nothing. No men, no bodies, no raft. But slowly, the bay started to spit out clues. 2 days later, a paddle made of plywood washed up on the shore. Then, a plastic bag was found floating in the water. Inside was a wallet. It belonged to Anglin. It contained names, addresses, and family photos. Items a man would surely keep if he were alive. Finally, they found pieces of the rubber raincoat raft. It was torn to shreds. The FBI connected the dots. The raft had failed. The glue didn't hold in the rough water. The official report was cold and final. The escapees drowned in the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay. Their bodies were swept out to sea. Case closed, or so they thought. 6 weeks after the escape, a Norwegian freighter ship was sailing through the Pacific, 20 miles past the Golden Gate Bridge. The crew spotted a body floating in the water. It was face down. The captain noted in the logbook that the corpse was wearing navy blue trousers, the exact uniform of an Alcatraz prisoner. The FBI didn't get the report until weeks later. By then, the body was gone. And then, there were the letters. For years, the mother of the Anglin brothers received Christmas cards. They were signed by John and Clarence. The FBI analyzed the handwriting. It was a match, but the strangest clue of all was a photograph. Decades later, a childhood friend of the Anglins produced a photo taken in Brazil in 1975. It showed 2 middle-aged men standing by a farm. Forensic experts analyzed the facial structures. the distance between the eyes, the shape of the ears. They concluded it was highly likely to be John and Clarence Anglin, alive, free, and laughing at the world. For 50 years, the FBI stuck to their story. The men drowned. The case was cold. But in 2013, the San Francisco Police Department received a letter. It wasn't postmarked from Brazil. It was postmarked from right here, in the United States. The opening line sent chills down the spine of every agent who read it. It read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in June 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. Yes, we all made it that night, but barely." The letter went on to claim that Frank Morris had died in 2005. Clarence died in 2011. And then, the author offered the FBI a deal. "If you announce on TV that I will be promised to first go to jail for no more than a year and get medical attention, I will write back to let you know exactly where I am. This is no joke." The FBI reopened the file. They tested the paper for fingerprints. They analyzed the handwriting against John Anglin's old prison letters. The results? Inconclusive. They couldn't prove it was him, but they couldn't prove it wasn't. The FBI never took the deal. The author never wrote back. Today, if you visit Alcatraz, you can still see the holes in the cell walls. You can still see the dummy heads sleeping in the beds. The U.S. Marshals state that the warrant for their arrest never expires. They will be hunted until they turn 99 years old. Did they drown in the cold, dark water? Or did 3 bank robbers outsmart the most powerful government in the world and live the rest of their lives in freedom? The FBI says it's impossible, but as Frank Morris proved, nothing is impossible if you have a spoon, a raincoat, and enough time. What do you think really happened that night? Did they make it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more impossible stories from American history, make sure to hit that subscribe button.